Coach Vance Newgard here, Senior International Weightlifting Coach and Professor of Sport and Exercise Science. So I am going to be going over training for strength endurance and for muscle hypertrophy for strength athletes in particular. And a lot of strength athletes, strength coaches would call this general physical preparation. So we're going to look at the nuances and how you actually would set up, for example, one exercise to plan for this training, and what are the differences. They are kind of minute, but depending on your athlete and what you want to do, it might be important to understand them, especially as your athletes advance and whatnot. So first of all, there is no hypertrophy zone, right? So it used to be believed it was like 6 to 12 repetitions or 6 to 15 repetitions or that sort of thing, the bro science type of stuff. We now know that as long as load is equated, it equals kind of the same muscle hypertrophy. So you can do 6 sets of 5, you can do 3 sets of 10, you can do 10 sets of 3, all equated, and you get kind of the same results, at least the same measurable results. Maybe that changes the more advanced you get, maybe not. One has more stress on the joints, one has less, one's more practical, one's more time consuming. So in the end, you typically start choosing what's in the middle anyway, because it is typically the most practical. But you can use a lot of different rep schemes to get muscle hypertrophy. So if you're using kind of the moderate loads, somewhere between 6 and 12 repetitions or whatever, then the idea is, well, you're also training your strength endurance. So that's strength endurance for a strength athlete. It would not be strength endurance for an endurance athlete, an aerobic endurance athlete. A marathon runner would be wanting to train their slow twitch muscle fibers, right? They're not going to get it with 10 reps. They're going to get with time sets, 2 minutes of squats or that sort of thing, training their slow twitch. So that is a little bit different. So the exercise we choose is irrelevant. So that could be squats, lunges, presses, throwing your enemies off a bridge, whatever your exercise is, doesn't really matter for this. So we have 4 different schemes I've put up here. So one is straight sets. So 70 kilos, 4 sets of 10, right? So these are the working sets. Nothing changes, just repeat them. First set might be like 4 reps from failure. The second set might be 3 reps from failure, and so on. The last set would be the most challenging. The first set would be relatively easy. Or you can do a low to high half pyramid. So working from 65 kilos, for example, up to 78 kilos, and it's kind of the same thing. This will be the easiest set, and it'll become more challenging as you go. The last set will be very fatiguing because you're already fairly fatigued, right? And then we can do a high to low half pyramid, right? So starting at 80 and working down to 70, right? So you do 80 for 10, it's going to be fairly close to failure, if not failure. So you have to drop the weight or drop the repetition. So here we're dropping the weights on each set. And then finally, we could just drop the repetitions. So we can keep everything the same. 80 kilos for 10, 80 kilos for 8, 80 kilos for 6, 80 kilos for 5, right? So the first set is close to failure, so I have to drop the number of repetitions on each set. So if I go by the literature reviews, if we're only interested in muscle hypertrophy, we don't worry so much about strength or strength endurance. Literature reviews basically say these all result in the same, all right? So that might change the more advanced an athlete gets, because a lot of these studies aren't with very advanced athletes. But it seems to be that as long as you do this, the total number of sets, as long as they're equal, you get kind of the same results, which leads to some arguments about whether should you even count total volume, reps times weight times sets, just for muscle hypertrophy. So maybe only the number of sets is what you should actually look at, because it seems to be that maybe it doesn't make a difference. And that could just because the differences in load aren't enough to cause differences in muscle hypertrophy itself, right? But if you do look at the load and the average intensity, they do change, right? So the straight sets, if I do 4 sets of 10 at 70 kilos, I actually have the highest training load, 2,800 kilograms. If I was really wanting to nerd out, I would convert this into kilojoules or newtons, and that would tell you your total work. The average intensity, though, is the lowest, 70%. So if you're just going by essentially your tolerance to do work and build some muscle hypertrophy, then this is probably how you should train. You are doing the most work, so you're going to adapt to doing more total work. So if you want to call strength endurance or this phase a work capacity phase, then this is probably how you should train. All right, so that's a little counterintuitive, like, oh, the weight, this is the lightest amount of weights, but you're doing the most amount of work. All right, so that's how that works. The low to high training is in between the others in terms of the total work, and it's in between the others in terms of the total intensity, or the average intensity as well. So it's in the middle somewhere, so you can decide, maybe I don't want to do as much work, so this might be a little bit easier to recover from. But also, if you look at the literature and those athletes who do this training and are surveyed, they say this is the most difficult for them to actually do. They dislike it the most, right? So for that reason, I probably wouldn't choose this training, right? Unless it was so much better than the rest of it. It is the most unpleasant. Why? Because you're accumulating fatigue on every set, and you're going to get bored, right? And you're going to get discouraged. The heavier you go, this sucks, this sucks, this sucks, this sucks, all right? And you're going to dislike it. So that's kind of what people report. If you're doing the high to low half pyramid, right, that's still somewhere in the middle at a lower total intensity. But since you're starting with a higher weight, it's probably going to have a bigger effect on your strength and your motor unit recruitment on that first set. In general, you're going to be lifting it the fastest, whatnot, and it's kind of like the suckiness of it goes down, so it's a little bit easier to manage. In fact, some people take these other sets too lightly, and I have to yell at my athletes to not blow off the lighter sets, right? And if we just reduce the repetitions, for example, that is the lowest amount of work you can do, but at the highest intensity. This is probably the easiest to recover from in terms of your neuromuscular system. but probably the hardest on your joints just because every set is heavier than the other schemes. So this one, right, if you're really interested in strength, is probably the best way to do it, but it doesn't give you the same strength endurance or the same work capacity as some of the other schemes. So you have to look at what do you want for your athletes, what do they need at the time, what's their level of training, and how will I decide which of these schemes to actually use, because the end result with muscle hypertrophy is very similar. Do I want differences in work capacity, or do I want differences in strength endurance?